Wow, okay. Right on. Am I coming through the system? Yeah. What a subtly beautiful PA. Nice. Hi. It's good to see you today. In the words of Rorschach in the movie The Watchmen, you think that I'm locked in here with you, but you're locked in here with me. We're going to have a fun time here this morning, and I want to figure out what I'm going to talk about at this particular moment. I don't know. So to do that, I'm going to have to figure something out about you. So very simple, we're going to do some polling, like good Barna people, and this one's really simple. If you've heard me on the Liturgist podcast, or Ask Science Mike, or read my book, Finding God in the Ways before, would you raise your hand? Hometown crowd. Okay, hands down. If like before Rubicon you'd never heard of this weirdo Science Mike, would you raise your hand? Okay, all right. So we'll catch you up to the rest of the room. Let's start with my qualifications and credentials. Why I am an expert. So people call me Science Mike, and I love science, and that little name of being known for a discipline of human knowledge may lead you to believe rather reasonably that I am a scientist, and that would be a terrible assumption because I am not a scientist. I did go to Tallahassee Community College for 6 amazing weeks, but then I dropped out to pursue a career in technology consulting because the money was better than student loans. And I do talk about issues of faith, so if you've never heard of me, you might be, okay, so he's a pastor, or he speaks on behalf of some Christian denomination. Not exactly. I mean, I was ordained as a deacon in the Southern Baptist Church, but they took that back when I became a United Methodist. So, 0 for 2, why in the world am I on stage and you in the seats? I think it's because I have a lovely, rich, velvety baritone voice that makes people feel like what I say matters. Or I have a life full of joy and sorrow and heartbreak related to this idea of God. I grew up as a Southern Baptist, was extremely faithful to that tradition, found its theological answers to be beyond satisfying to the point of being meaning-making. My life made sense when I knew my purpose was to know and serve God. And that was a real fun time until my father, a minister in our church, had an affair and left my mom. And I told him that he couldn't do that because it wasn't biblical. And searched in the Bible a better understanding of marriage to lead my father back to a right relationship with God. And since I'm a fellow geek, my tact was to try to memorize the Bible, reading it 4 times in 1 year, at the end of which exactly what happened is what you would expect. I became an atheist. So I didn't believe in God anymore, and I'm 100% serious that the primary thing that led me out of my faith was, in fact, studying God's Word. So I was an atheist for a while with one small caveat. I didn't tell my friends and family because I was afraid of being rejected. So I was a Southern Baptist atheist Sunday school teacher deacon, which is a slightly conflicted place to live, let's be honest. And so my wife figured out that I didn't believe anymore. I told her, listen, if anybody finds out, our whole social life is going to be in question. We could be rejected from our families. And so she, faithful to her word, kept my secret for 2 full weeks before she told my mother. And that led to the weirdest period of my life where I felt both ostracized in identity from my family, but also accepted in a very difficult time. And that laid the ground for something remarkable to happen. I met God. And in my story, in a remarkable way, that involves standing on a beach in the middle of the night and seeing a bright light float in the air that moved toward me and enveloped my entire field of vision and made me feel God's love for me and God's love for everyone. And being a good atheist, I responded to that experience by asking my neurologist for a CAT scan because I was convinced I had brain cancer. Got a CAT scan and an MRI, and son of a gun, no brain tumor. So now I was stuck with this thing. Is there a God? If so, who is this God? And what does this God have to do with us? And the last few years of my life have been publicly exploring those questions with a lot more emphasis on creating community where questions are allowed than honoring any particular set of answers. And in the process, a few million millennials and post-millennials all around the world have joined that conversation. So since a lot of you, I think, are already familiar with that story, if you're not, don't worry, you can buy it in the best-selling book, Finding God in the Waves. Or if you're cheap, listen to it on the internet. My time with Pete Holmes was especially fun. But I think today, instead, we'll talk about prayer. Because as we're here in this tension between, well, generations in a relationship with God and how they relate to God and how they relate to labels like Christian, I think something gets lost. People in their 70s doubt God exists too. People in their 90s, people on their deathbed doubt this simple question. Does God listen when I pray? Is God listening? Sometimes in our life, God feels very close and very intimate and very dear to us. And other times, God feels distant. God feels remote. In fact, sometimes, and I speak with personal experience, God can feel downright absurd. In my journey from faith toward atheism, I read a lovely book with a silver cover called The God Delusion. It was written by an evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins. And when I first started reading The God Delusion, I found it to be a remarkably weak argument against God's existence, full of tropes that my study of Christian apologetics easily helped me to dispel, until Richard Dawkins began to talk about the very heart of my faith, which was prayer. You see, as even a small child, I'd prayed every day. You might not be able to tell from my phenomenal physique today, but I was a fat kid. And like a really pudgy, coppery red-haired kid who wore Hawaiian shirts and was into computer programming. And that may surprise you to know was not the recipe for popularity in the United States in the 1980s. And I had an interesting set of circumstances where every day when the bell at recess rang, I faced a choice. Do I go to the playground with all the other kids and get beat up or made fun of? Or do I run the other way to literally hide behind a strand of trees, out of sight, out of mind? So of course I ran to the trees every day. But I'm an extrovert, I love people, I love talking, I really love hearing my own voice. And I couldn't just stand out in the trees lonely. So I talked to my best friend, Jesus, who listened every day, who never made fun of me, who never called me fat, who never said my shirt was ugly, who always accepted me. How did I know? Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. And I had such an intimate relationship with God through prayer. And then I read this God Delusion book. And Richard Dawkins starts pointing out studies that show that when we've studied the efficacy of prayer and people being healed, there really isn't any. In the very few admittedly small sample size studies that have been done, it's appeared that if anything, being prayed for has a slightly negative effect on health outcomes. And the researchers surmised, this was not a research-based hypothesis, this was their opinion on the actual results of their study, was that there was a performance anxiety for people in hospitals when they knew people were praying for them. They wanted to get better to not let people down, and therefore stress their bodies just enough to not get better as often. And I was like, oh, wow, no, that's not true. we prayed for my grandmother, and she had cancer, and her cancer went away before chemo or radiation. I mean, this is a real thing that happened in my life. My grandmother had tumors in her lungs in one x-ray and not in the next, and God provided a miracle. But as I continued to read, Richard Dawkins says that if you pray to a milk jug, you'll get the same results as praying to God. What? Come on, Richard Dawkins. That's weak sauce. But Dawkins said that when we say God answers prayer, that God offers 3 possible outcomes. Yes, no, or wait. Right? Has anyone ever heard that language in church before? Dawkins points out that that's everything that can happen in any situation. If you pray for something, what other option is there? It happens, it doesn't happen, it happens later. So I took this thought experiment literally, which is kind of a fundamentalist thing to do, and I actually bought a jug of milk and put it in the fridge and started praying to it. So I asked a jug of milk for a promotion at work, and I got it. So my faith is falling apart. I'm doubting the Bible, and I'm praying to a jug of milk, and it works. So I'm like, so wait a minute. Am I a milkist now? Like, is the divine incarnation in this 2%? And then does that mean in 2 weeks when it expires, I just have to keep this jug forever as it gets increasingly discolored and strangely bulging? Or, as an act of service to the bovine goddess, do I get another jug of milk and replace it every 2 weeks and simply have this be my altar to the divine, which, as you're all imagining, is utterly absurd. I just want you to know I just made that up, and I'm incredibly impressed with myself. You will hear that one in the future. So, it's kind of funny. We're having a good time. What this actually led me to was a profound existential crisis. A total loss of faith, a rejection of everything I've ever known, and a new opinion that contrary to being the incarnate Son of God, Jesus was a mythological figure cobbled together from several first-century rabbis. That there was no God, there was no hell, there was no heaven, that all that exists simply emerged somewhat randomly from a cosmic singularity. So I know what it means to say God feels distant or absurd or prayer doesn't matter. By the way, somewhat shortly after I prayed to the milk jug and got a promotion, my grandmother's cancer came back and she died. Even though my family got together and held hands and prayed and sang the same way they did the first time, this time prayers weren't answered. When we talk about a God who answers prayer, we raise all kinds of troubling, logical issues. Why does God answer some prayers and not other prayers? I told you a few minutes ago that at one point in my life, I looked out into the ocean and literally saw a bright light in the air before me. Before I saw that light, I got to sit down with one of Time's most 100 influential people who happened to be a Christian who writes books to talk about my faith questions. Because my mother had prayed if God would move so powerfully in my life that I couldn't deny that it was God. And my mom said, this was answered prayer. But I couldn't help but think of war-torn areas and nations in the country of Africa where Christian mothers are praying for something more simple, that their children not starve to death, that their children not be slaughtered in war, and those prayers go unanswered. Where is God's justice in my wealthy Western mom getting her dream, and yet those mothers not? Prayer's tough. Prayer's incredibly difficult. And I'm proud to tell you that I will answer none of the objections I just raised this morning. Just wanted to set expectations well. Instead, I'm going to show you how I live in a messy middle place. How can we, as followers of God, how can we, as people who love Christ, truly immerse ourselves in our faith in an age where sometimes science has better answers about the world than our theology? Or even if you don't believe that, spoiler alert, you're not going to win the argument with your nephew about the authority of the Bible versus cosmology. Cosmology shows its work. Cosmology builds iPhones. Cosmology puts nuclear-powered robots on Mars, right? It works. Science works. But when we truly engage the materialism that underlies modern worldviews, often this sacred, cherished part of our lives, our faith, evaporates. And I think that's actually a negative thing. There's a reason I'm not a new atheist. There's a reason I don't tour the world trying to convince people to not believe in God, because I have too readily seen the powerful movement of God in people's lives. So what I hope to tell you about today is, regardless of where you are theologically, anywhere from a very confident monotheistic Christian who believes in a theistic God moving in the world through miracles, or a total skeptic, atheist, who doesn't believe in God at all or the supernatural, I believe that science demonstrates prayer can meet people all across that entire spectrum. Here's how. I can't memorize the stats, so by the way, most of these are lifted from Barna. In the United States, 76% of people believe that prayer has power. 62% pray regularly. Those numbers are stunningly higher than I thought. As alluded to, the U.S. is becoming a much less religious country than this one. 74% of people who pray about personal challenges, and 56% believe that most of their prayers are answered. And then 37% say that only some of their prayers are answered. And then a tiny 14% say, I don't know if my prayers are answered. Small caveat, that's the entire population. When you break those numbers down by generation, you find that they almost reverse among young people. Reverse. So a majority of young people don't pray, and among those who do, they don't believe their prayers are answered. Which is like the most Christian thing I can imagine. The Gospels have an account of an obscure Bible figure called Jesus wandering the desert, trying to figure out his role in life and whether God is listening, and dealing with temptations regarding his identity and calling in life. I think wondering what prayer does is something Christ himself did. So in this space of what does prayer do, I found something really encouraging. We have brains. Inside your skull is the most mysterious, intricate, and complex matter in the universe, the human brain, at least according to human brains. Like, I love, now think about it for just a second. Human brains say human brains are amazing, which is why I love neuroscience. It's the only science where something studies itself, right? It's a human brain studying human brains. I just love the recursion. And when we brain scan people who pray, we find something remarkable. It completely transforms their neurological mode of operation. So people who pray, let's say at least 6 times a week for 25 minutes a day, they have a change in the growth rate of gray matter in 2 parts of their brain. One is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that coordinates focus and concentration and agency. It's a pretty important part of the brain. The other part of the brain that experiences tissue growth is the anterior cingulate cortex, and that's the seat of compassion and empathy in the human brain. We also find that their amygdala, the part of the brain that coordinates fear and anger, becomes less responsive, right? So let's talk about what these parts of the brains do. When you do your taxes, when you make plans for the future, that's happening primarily in the prefrontal cortex. When you feel moved by someone's hurting, or you feel compassionate towards them, that's your anterior cingulate cortex. When someone cuts you off in traffic and you show them a particular finger, that's your amygdala coordinating your physiological response. So people who pray regularly are less likely to have their amygdala respond to stimulus and more likely to respond thoughtfully or compassionately just because they pray often. Now, it's not without caveats. As scientists have investigated how human brains respond to beliefs about God, a discipline called neurotheology, they have found that across all world faiths, there's really only two dominant models of God that happen in the human brain. The first is an angry God. I'd call this the Old Testament God, or the OG, the original gangsta God. And just because I think it's hilarious. When people pray to an angry God, they don't get the same effects as what I just talked about. People who believe God is primarily angry or wrathful see an increase in activity in their amygdala. Their blood pressure goes up. The amount of stress hormones they produce goes up. Behaviorally, they have trouble forgiving themselves. They have trouble forgiving other people. They also are fearful of outsiders, right? So we have a lot of angry God people in the United States saying, build that wall, right? This theological framework turns out to have dramatic impacts on how we live and operate in the world. Now, it's not all bad if you believe in an angry God. People who believe in an angry God get exceptional impulse control. Because if you believe God might smite you, it turns out you control your behavior a little better, right? With some restriction, that gain is short term. An angry God understanding of behavioral dynamics often leads to periods of cessation or abstinence followed by dramatic behavioral recurrence, kind of a binge and purge cycle. So that's one picture of God that people pray to, the angry God. The other is if God is primarily loving or merciful. And that's when you see all those lovely brain tissue developments I talked about. That's when you see a reduction in response in the amygdala to given stimulus. That's when you find it easier to forgive yourself and to forgive others. Basically, people who pray or meditate regularly become more patient, more compassionate, less stressed out, healthier people. And independent of your theological framework, those are all pretty desirable things. So how do you pray to get those benefits? That's a big thing. Science has actually studied different forms of prayer and meditation to map which ones are most neurologically effective. And so I like to call this Teach Us Neuroscience to Pray. And there are basically 4 types of prayer and meditation that are very easy to do that can get you those benefits. I'm going to go over them now. If this is a thing that interests you, this is a particularly good moment to put pen on paper to remember later. And I'll kind of take you through these. And I'd like you to think which one goes along best with your personality and what you're comfortable with. And we'll talk it through so you can maybe figure out which ones may work best for you. So as we begin, the most basic form of prayer is simply talking to God. If you have an evangelical or charismatic background, this comes very easily to you. If you have a higher church background, it might seem slightly heretical or strange. But talking to God is literally talking to God aloud or in your mind. To get the most neurological benefits, you want to talk about your hopes, your dreams, and your fears. your hopes, your dreams, and your fears. A couple of things about this type of prayer. One, you get all the benefits we've talked about. Two, it's been shown to be similarly effective in treating emotional discomfort as going to a therapist, only it's free. So that's pretty powerful. Another thing about talking to God, if you feel like God is distant and you wish God felt closer, in studies, people have universally, upwards of 80% of people have reported feeling closer to God at the end of a 6-week prayer program than they did at the beginning, and this includes people who identify as atheists. So atheists at the end of 6 to 8 weeks have felt closer to a God they do not believe in after 6 weeks of prayer. Now, how's that possible? Brains are weird. Your consciousness presents itself to you as a cohesive narrative that's pretty logical and reasonable, and everyone else is unreasonable. That's a cognitive bias. The fact is, your beliefs emerge from different brain structures and different networks of brain structures working in concert, and they have competing priorities. The part of your brain that makes evaluations of belief statements is not the same part of the brain that experiences God. Did you know that? So it is entirely possible to have an intellectual or cognitive disbelief in God, but experiences and feelings where God is near, because your brain is a ball of spaghetti. So that's basic prayer. Number one, hopes, dreams, fears can be as effective as therapy. If it seems weird to talk to God, or you don't believe in God enough to talk to God, I get that. When I first started to investigate spiritual practice again on the other side of atheism, every time I bowed my head to pray, I felt like a 50-year-old man standing in line to see Santa Claus. It was just awkward and strange, and I don't belong here. So if you can't talk to God for whatever reason, a basic focus on compassion meditation is for you. Here's how you would do that. You light a candle, and then you look at it. Congratulations, that's the meditation. Now, there's a couple of things methodologically that will help. Imagine the candle represents God's compassion. It's light, it's warm, it's not a very terribly difficult visual to carry through. And you're going to find, as so often happens in silent-based meditations, that you can do that successfully for maybe 8 to 15 seconds. And then you'll get distracted, because you've been trained by these devices to constantly have dopamine cravings satisfied by a mm-mm. So I'd start by putting this thing on airplane mode so it doesn't mm-mm. But then when it doesn't go mm-mm, you're going to wish it went mm-mm because you're so bored, right? You'll start thinking about the bills you haven't paid. You'll start thinking about conversations you need to have, what somebody said to you yesterday that hurt your feelings or reduce your social standing, because you're a social primate obsessed with social standing. And your monkey brain has a quiet moment to tell your consciousness, hey, they slighted us. We should get revenge. And what I'm telling you to do in that moment is just take your attention, just go, good job, monkey brain. Thank you for thinking those things. And just gently return your attention back to the candle, okay? That's it. That's the whole thing. Every time you realize you're not looking at the candle, look at the candle again. Every time you realize you're spaced out looking at the candle, but not paying attention to the candle, pay attention to the candle. How long? Start with 3 minutes. Then move to 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. Basically, as you do this more often, you will find an inner silence comes easier. And that's when your brain is starting to respond to a meditative practice. Now, what if sitting in silence is too weird and talking to God is too weird? You can do something called the Lectio Divina, the divine reading of Scripture. And this is a slow reading of the Bible without making fat claims. We're not trying to determine whether the events on the Bible's pages really happened or not. That's no big deal in this type of meditation. The goal in this type of divine reading is to see what the Bible might say to you in your life. So it's perfectly fine to view the Bible as a book of ancient mythology if that's where you are. It's perfectly fine to view the Bible as God's perfect and inerrant word if that's where you are. Either way, you're simply trying to see what the Bible will say to you. You take a small passage of Scripture, a daily Bible reading plan, the lectionary, there's lots of sources to find a nice chunk. You read it 3 times. And the first time you read it, you look for words or phrases that jump out to you. So you read and you sit and you simply contemplate those words and phrases. And if that works, then you go back and you read the text again, and now you think how those words or phrases apply to your life today. Step 1, what words and phrases jump out? 2, how do they apply to your life? Then on the third reading, you think what action God may be inviting you toward using those words and phrases. So this is, if you can read, you can do this meditation. And in studies, it has been just as effective at causing neurological changes and making people feel close to God. I mess with my mic, they hate that. And making people feel close to God as the other forms of meditation. So this is a profound truth from neuroscience. Reading in a meditative practice can transform your brain and give you neurological benefits and make you feel closer to God. So if you've noticed, we have three approaches here. One involves talking, one involves silence, and the other involves reading. So depending on whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, or imaginative or not, or verbal or not, one of those 3 techniques is likely to be pretty comfortable for you. I'd recommend you start there and give yourself a challenge. Try to pray that way consistently for 2 weeks. See how you feel. If it's working well, if you're not struggling, continue on through a 6-week program. If at the end of the 2 weeks that one's not working, no problem. Try a different type of prayer or meditation until one takes you someplace. Now that takes us to another important point. I've met so many people in the West who say they failed at meditation. They tried it and nothing happened. Here's a spoiler alert. The entire point of meditation is for nothing to happen. That's not a problem. That means you succeeded, which is an important point. The only way to fail at meditation is to believe you failed at meditation, right? So let me give you one last thing here, and that's the 4 pillars of successful prayer and meditation, neurologically speaking. I'm not making theological claims this morning. I'm making neurological claims this morning. The first is don't judge. Be non-judgmental towards yourself and towards the practice, which is, man, that is tough for Western people. We are a discerning group, deeply judgmental. Okay, so no judgment. 2, relax. You want to relax your body. You want to take the time to get calm and breathe, to be still. Again, this is antithetical to how we live our lives. But stillness and quiet and relaxation are essential to prayer. The third is awareness. You want to be aware of every moment. The candle meditation is particularly good at teaching you to live moment by moment, not thinking about the past or the future, simply being aware of this moment. And the 4th pillar of success is intention. Before you begin your prayer practice, simply remind yourself of why you're doing it. Is it because you want to feel closer to God? Is it because you want to be more compassionate? Is it because you need a break from social media? Is it because your kids are driving you crazy? Like whatever it is, it's fine. Don't judge the intention. Just have one, and that becomes the seed that your practice is built on. So you'll notice I raised a bunch of logical contradictions about prayer, didn't answer them, talked about the science of how prayer affects the brain, and that might leave you with kind of a hanging thing in the air. Does God answer prayer? Does praying in an intercessory way, asking God to act in the universe on behalf of ourselves or others, does it work? Well, when I was writing my first book, Finding God in the Waves. Writing the chapter on prayer, believe it or not. I am a writer full-time now, which is amazing because I get to do ridiculous things like say, I don't take calls until lunch because I'm writing. And I am a creator. So I leave my phone on airplane mode and no calls. Well, the house phone rang during my quiet hours of writing. And I thought, the audacity of that telemarketer, but that's okay. Jenny's home, my wife, she'll get the phone. She did, thank goodness. And I heard her say, oh, he's writing right now. I was like, good job, you tell him. And then she said, hold on, I'll give him the phone. And I was like, the audacity, the gall of bringing me the phone in my quiet hours. She brings me the phone. Hello? Can you hear the displeasure in my voice? Hello? And it's like a guy I haven't talked to in 4 years at our old church. And I'm kind of looking at Jenny in disbelief that she would bring me the phone. And he says, hey, Mike, how you doing? I'm like, I'm good. I'm writing. So do you hear the accusation? And he says, are you sitting down? I was like, of course. I'm writing. And he says, well, I'm in Orlando with your dad at a conference, and he's had a major stroke, and we're not sure if he's going to make it, so you should get in the car and come right now. Now remember, this is on the other side of the milk jug. I haven't prayed in an intercessory prayer since I lost my faith. My entire prayer practice had become about neurological benefits and being in God's presence so that I could be transformed. And as I drove to Orlando, thinking about my dad, this superhero of a man in my life, and I arrive in the in the hospital room, and there's my dad in a bed, half of his face etched with the most intense pain I've ever seen, and the other half completely relaxed. He had left side paralysis. I took his hand, and he complained that his head hurt so much that he just wanted us to take washcloths, dip them in ice, and put them on his forehead and constantly change them. So I did that for some hours, and then the doctor said we needed to go. So I went into a hotel room, and I knelt on the ground, and I leaned down so far that I put my nose on the carpet of that hotel room floor, and I just wept. I just wept. And I was weeping with a mailing address. Every tear was postmarked to the divine. And when I got enough grief out of my heart, I said, God, why? My dad is such a strong man. He's so athletic. Why him? He can't survive half paralyzed. He'll become so depressed he'll kill himself if he makes it through this. And I asked God for a miracle. I asked God to heal my father. Only now I wasn't taking pocket change of my personal righteousness or relationship with Jesus and feeding them into a divine vending machine, pressing a button, waiting for a can of miracle to pop out as I'd done 1,000 times in my life as a Southern Baptist. On this hotel room floor, my prayer was an admission that in this situation, I was utterly helpless and had nowhere to turn. And for completely absurd reasons, I believe that at the center of all things is love. And I just wanted some of that love to reach my father one more time. And Dad was a miracle. He walks today. He can use both arms. He can use both legs. And I understand that we would have gotten the same result if I asked the milk jug. And I understand that many other people pray in the same circumstance for a miracle and that their fathers never walk again. I don't know if God answers prayer or not. But I know sometimes when we have nowhere else to turn, when we reach out for love, love reaches back. Thank you.